I'd like to welcome everyone to this joint event organised by GAD and the GAD Women of Colour Forum against white feminism, a conversation with Rafia Zakaria. It's great to see some of our trustees here, some of our ex-trustees here, some of our ex-staff members here. It's fantastic. So welcome everybody. I'm going to introduce the speakers in a minute, but first of all, I just wanted to give everyone a bit of background. For those of you who don't know, the Women of Colour Forum is a body within the Gender and Development Network, made up of self-identifying women of colour who are working in the UK international development sector. And the idea is that the forum acts as a safe space for support, healing and collective strategising against systematic racism and misogyny in the sector. And we wanted to thank members of the forum for helping organise this event and for suggesting questions, but also much more broadly for the important contribution that the forum's made to GAD's approach to race and decolonisation. So I just wanted to explain a little bit about why we think this meeting is so important to GAD's work. And some of you will remember that about 2.5 years ago, there was a meeting within the Gender and Development Network on intersectional feminism with Mariah Larasti. And that was really the first time that we got clear support from network members for a specific focus on race and decolonisation within our work. And it also marked the launch of the Women of Colour Forum. 6 months later, the board agreed that our location within the UK international development sector meant that we really couldn't promote a feminist approach without prioritising decolonisation and anti-racism. And I think that was a really important point within the network. Clearly, we are constantly trying to learn from others in developing our approach and our analysis, which is why we're so pleased to have the meeting today, among other things. But in the interest of transparency, we just thought we wanted to share some of the initial guiding principles that we've been working on as a secretariat and also that we've discussed with the board. I'm going to read them out because we've worked very carefully on the specific wording. The first is that the experience of colonialism and neocolonialism continues to shape the lived realities of women in the global south and determine unequal power relations globally. The promotion of decolonisation and an intersectional approach to anti-racism must therefore be an integral part of our work on gender equality and women's rights. Our second guiding principle is that the UK international development sector plays a role in perpetuating neocolonialism, and the network's location within this sector requires us to intentionally decolonise our work. We do this, for example, by making visible and working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of colonialism perpetuated by the UK across the global south, by acknowledging and centering the knowledge and expertise of Southern feminists, and by providing them with access to our funders and decision makers. And the third one, and this is in some ways the one that this meeting is particularly relevant to, is that recognising that racism exists within our society, we must intentionally address it through our ways of working, and that white women amongst us must acknowledge our privilege and power in this context to be better allies. And fourthly, that the burden of promoting and executing anti-racism and decolonisation work must not fall on the shoulders of Black women and women of colour within the network, but must be shared by white women, while ensuring that the voices and views of Black women and women of colour in the sector predominate. So those are by no means perfect, but they're the 4 initial guiding principles that we're working on. And I wanted to be transparent about the kind of work that we're doing so far, but also those are the kind of things that we've been tackling with when we're shaping what we do. So I'd like to move on to introducing our guests. First of all, our guest of honour, author of Against White Feminism, Notes on Disruption, Rafia Zakaria. Rafia is a lawyer, a human rights activist and author of 3 books. Her writing on global feminist and immigrant issues has appeared in the Bafla and Dawn, Pakistan's largest English language daily, where she writes regular columns. And she's also written for the New York Times, the Guardian, CNN, Opinion, and many more. She's currently a research scholar at the Colin Powell Center for Civic Leadership at City College, New York. Born and raised in Karachi, she now lives in Indiana. So welcome, Rafia. Then moderating today from the GAD Women of Colour Forum, we've got Sarah Nell Benjamin, who many of you already know, who's head of partnerships at Oxfam GB. Sarah Nell, who's originally from South Africa, is a former anti-apartheid and anti-poverty campaigner who's worked in the international development sector for 20 years and is currently leading Oxfam GB's anti-racism and decolonisation work. And then also co-moderating today's event is our own Sophia Frange, Head of Policy at GAD. And I also just wanted to introduce Catherine Dean, our coordinator, and Yamina Oldali, our Comms and Policy Officer, who's managing our tech and our QA portion of today. So just before we move on to our discussion with Rafia, Sarah Null was going to add some more things.
Thank you so much, Jess, and so lovely to be in the GADN space again and to see so many faces that I recognize and people I've seen before. So lovely to be here. Thank you for having me. So I thought I'd just outline some of the objectives of today's session, and there are three sessions that we have. So the first one is to create an open forum for candid and honest discussions between Black women, women of color, and white women. The second objective is for members to better understand the concept of white feminism and identify the ways in which it shows up, particularly in the context of international development. And the third one is to identify what meaningful allyship and solidarity looks like between Black women, women of color, and white women as part of collectively building a new kind of feminism. And so to help us go through this, navigate this space, we've put together a couple of guiding principles. And just to note that this is a learning and sharing space, and we're not going to get it right all the time, but just to help us navigate it, the first principle that we will hold the space in is that this is a shared and safe space for open and candid conversations. But having said that, I want to emphasize the presence of Black and women of color here today, and to be mindful that in order to create a safe space, I urge our white members to listen with an open heart and mind. So to listen actively and to not rush to questions or to the chat, but to listen and sit with whatever discomfort it is you're feeling. And also when asking questions, to please be intentional and check with ourselves first to make sure that the question that we're going to be asking is not to be harmful to our speaker, as well as to Black and women of color in this space. The second principle is recognition and respect of difference. And the third one is participation is voluntary, and there isn't a requirement to always verbally contribute, but also to say to our Black and women of color that if you are feeling triggered by anything that is being said here today, please do feel free to turn off your cameras, or if you need to leave the session, please do so. I'm now going to hand back to Sophie, who's going to outline the agenda for today.
Thanks so much, Sarah Null. So just very, very, very quickly before we can kick off with the session, it's just to give you an idea of what we're planning. So for the next 35 minutes, we'll have a discussion with Rafia in which we'll explore some key issues that are identified in the book, questions around definitions, intersectionality, allyship, and international development. We'll then also have 40 minutes allotted to have an open discussion and get you to pose your questions to Rafia, or just really simply share any comments or observations that you might have, after which we'll wrap up. And just very briefly to say that normally we'd include a secretariat update in our GADN meetings, but however on this occasion we thought that it was really important to give Rafia as much time as possible to share her insights. So we will be organising a separate meeting for members to provide you with the secretariat update, but also for you to share any of your updates. But just also to be on the lookout for the GADN member survey that we're going to be sending you out soon, just as a way for you to check in with us about what we're doing well and what we might need to improve. And just finally, just to add that, as you may know, typically we tend to have small breakout groups that accompany our main discussions during GADN members meeting. But on this occasion, we've instead opted to have a wider discussion amongst all of us during the Q&A, given the kind of topic that we're discussing. So just a reminder to everybody to please keep your microphones on mute until the Q&A. But also just to say that the Q&A is going to be open starting now, actually. So you might have ideas or thoughts that come to your mind as the conversation goes along. So please feel free to add those comments, those questions through the function that we've got, which is a platform called Menti. Yamina will put the link in the chat box for you, just for you to put in your thoughts and ideas as we go along. But there will be at a later point an opportunity for you to ask your questions verbally if you prefer. So that's just one of the options that we have. So with that, finally, we can kick off today's session. So Rafia, welcome again. We are immensely delighted to have you here with us. So what we've done, what we've got is a series of questions for you covering a range of different themes, which we'll ask you in pairs, in sets of questions, largely to avoid overlap, because there were loads and loads of brilliant questions that we received from forum members, but also because your book is so rich, it covers so many brilliant areas, and we've tried to kind of condense some of the key takeaways in these questions. So I'll kick off, and then I'll hand over to Saranel and Jess to carry on the discussions. So the first set of questions, Rafia, is on definitions. So I guess I'll kick off by saying, what do you mean by the term white feminism? And what are some of the common misconceptions that come with that term? And Saranel, over to you for the second part of that question on definitions.
Thanks, Sophie. So the next question is, following on from what Sophie had just asked, what ideas or spaces might be closed down by naming white feminism? Does and should this actually matter? So over to you, Rafia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for being here, for especially Sophie, for like arranging all the logistics of this event and finding a date and everything. So I'm really, I'm really honored to be here. I really think that you, this group in particular, is at the front lines of change, and some of that is even reflected in the statements that you made just now. So it's really in some ways a dream space for me to be in. I faced lots of hostile audiences, so yeah, this is great. In terms of white feminism, the first sentence of my book defines white feminism not as a white person or white woman who is a feminist, but rather as a particular orientation that seeks to maintain white privilege and does not want to reflect or analyze the ways in which that white privilege influences our policies, our priorities, how we are in the world, and the fact that like almost everything in our current moment, our post-colonial moment, we have to recognize that our past comes to us from the lens of a white supremacist society. And so, my goal really was to try to, to be really honest, right? As someone who was born and raised in Pakistan, and then, I worked in all these different forums, international NGOs, Amnesty, etc. And I felt that there was, quite honestly, I felt that the vast majority of the world's women, which are women of color, had already given up on feminism. It just wasn't relevant anymore because it was so centered on whiteness and white privilege and the domination, and almost like the domination often by white women, right? And I wanted to try and see if I could excise whiteness from feminism, so that what we would have left, or what we would reconstruct, is something that did have relevance to the majority of the world's population. And so, in that sense, this book is kind of a first attempt, right? This is something, where I'm very anxious to hear your feedback, but it would have been, I would have liked to include the procedural mechanisms, the precise procedural mechanisms that work to alienate women of color, right? Because everybody, you're not going to find anyone in our world today that says, oh, well, I don't like diversity, and I don't want to be inclusive. But unfortunately, even though we have lip service to those ideas of diversity and inclusion, you don't see it in in the governance of large international NGOs. So, right now, I think the 15 largest humanitarian organizations in the world, the transnational organizations, of those organizations, of their boards, only 2% of people on their boards are, even people who who originate from a country that receives aid. So what you have then is, of course, it means that you basically have white boards, and they are deciding without ever knowing the conditions or what it's like to be someone who comes from a country that receives aid. So, that is a pretty damning statistic in my view, because it shows like, it's a test of the depth of commitment to inclusion and to a more just and inclusive ideas of development. So, so those were the ideas that kind of led me to this book. I felt that if I could provide a framework and a rudimentary vocabulary so that these behaviors could be discussed, and then because once you make them intelligible, that cannot be erased, right? Because now you've pointed out a behavior. And so, I mean, of course, like, people might choose not to change that behavior, but at least you have sort of drawn a circle around it, which I'm an optimist, which I believe, is the first step to sort of making people aware. So in that sense, the book is asking that, the larger purpose of the book, of each chapter in the book, is to show how whiteness and ideas of white supremacy permeate all these different aspects of feminism, and how they have been, so with the hope that can now be the basis for some transformational work to remove them. I never thought I'd be able to write this book and that it would be published, because even, I would say, 2018, it was not really, it was very difficult to say white this or white that, because there was such a obstinate adherence to this idea that whiteness is inchoate and invisible, and it is the objective neutral force. So you can't really criticize it because it's a a negative identity. So it's not something itself, and you can't show its existence. Like, say, you could say about, well, this is Indian culture, or this is this. So when I sold the book I went through a lot to finally find, I had to fire an agent, get a new agent, and finally find a publisher who would publish this. And I got very lucky in terms of a small window that existed after the murder of George Floyd, that sort of, is giving impetus to this work. So yeah, those were my concerns. And the last thing I think was about the misconception about white feminism. Now, a lot of people have asked me why I named the book Against White Feminism, because it's provocative, and it doesn't necessarily explain the title and the sort of whiteness that I mean, and that I put in the first sentence in the first page. And I chose it because I feel that I was trying to break out of a niche, you know. I feel that books by brown and Black feminists are written, and you know, they get put on the side table where it's like, okay, like you want to be a good person, etc., like read a book by someone who's not white. But they never really make it to mainstream discussions about feminism and to ordinary readers. So I was intentionally provocative because I wanted people to open the book, pick it out, you know. The biggest misconception is this: like I feel that the white women who have gotten very defensive about this are defensive about, I mean, you know, one of the biggest hurdles this book tries to overcome is that white women see, for a number of complicated reasons, see themselves as victims, right? They see themselves as victims and pioneers who have broken all these glass ceilings to get up there and to be equal to white men. And that is, you know, the self-image that a lot of them have. Now, of course, I'm coming in and saying, well, you know, you are oppressing people too. And that is an anathema for a lot of white women, because it just simply goes against the self-image that they've had, their mothers have had, their grandmothers have had. And it forces them to consider that some of their successes are not entirely fair. And I realized that is a very tough place to go with a book. And so I guess at the outset, I want to say that for the women that are brave enough to do that and to take that on, you know, I in some cases, of course, it's intentional, but I try really hard in the book to point out that, you know, this is not, I don't impute malicious intent to all white women, as in, you know, they're sitting there plotting over a cauldron and, you know, stirring the pot and saying mean spells. I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying very hard to figure out why, particularly in the last, say, 20, 30 years, we continue to work on the same problems, and we have not had any tangible progress in terms of a cross-racial conversation within feminism. So that was my goal. You know, I mean, I felt that, you know, okay, 20 years, whatever, have passed, like, since I was a college student, and we're still, like, it's the same discussion still. And so, yeah, so that's the intent behind the book.
Thank you so much, Rafia. That was so powerful, and the things that you named, you know, and gave name to, made visible, was so clear in that. And I think that the response that you gave kind of leads us quite nicely into the next question that I have, which is around, you know, allyship and solidarity, and is it actually possible between women of color, Black and women of color, and white women, in order to collectively build a new kind of feminism? And if so, if that is possible, what are the hallmarks of this effective feminist partnership? And are there 3 things you could suggest white women do in order to become meaningful allies? And before you answer that, I'm just going to hand over to Jess to ask the second question in this allyship theme.
Thanks, and also, Rafia, one of the things for me that I felt came up very clearly in the book is you distinguishing between whiteness and being white. And I think you made that point very, very, very clearly in the book. And I think it's really helpful, because it means there's no excuse for white women to step back and do nothing. You're saying that white women should and can overcome our whiteness and become genuine allies. And, you know, similar to Sarah Nell's question, it would be really interesting to hear from you a bit more about how white women can become genuine allies, and not just because it makes us feel better or because it makes us look good in front of our colleagues, but how do we genuinely become good allies, recognizing the fear of getting it wrong often is leading, I think, white women to be silent, but also recognizing that asking questions like this itself adds to the burden of women of color. And how do we square that circle?
Okay, wow. So, you know, in terms of allyship, I don't think that there can be meaningful allyship until and unless there is this process of self-analysis and reckoning, right? Because if you don't do that, then you are operating, you're operating on an uneven field. You're not recognizing that the person you're talking to in all sorts of complicated social and cultural ways is not your equal. And if they're not your equal, then how can you be their ally? You know, that power disparity taints that relationship. So by making it, explicit that there is this power difference, you automatically then, that becomes a rule of that conversation. And I think that, that's really, really essential. The other very, very crucial thing, the second very, very crucial thing is that I feel white women have to recognize that the work that they have to do is not necessarily just in conversing with women of color. I think the bigger work they have to do is to talk to other white women. Obviously people who are white have greater access to, variety of communities. And it is only until you sort of commit to raising these issues, within circles that are not necessarily welcoming or simply just don't have women of color. Right. So I can write this book all I want, and I know obviously women of color are going to read it, but I can't, alone sell it to white women. And you can't, you can say that I read this book and it was uncomfortable, but it gave me insight to why we are at this impasse right now, where things aren't really moving forward. We're having the same discussions over and over again. And so that is important. And the third thing I think is, a special attention to history, right? I mean, stop talking about the waves, like just stop. Everybody stop talking about the waves, because that whole history of feminism beginning at the struggle for suffrage is a very, very white Western centered narrative. And if you're going to do, if you're going to try to work for parity, you have to sort of dislodge that narrative. You have to say, we need to, and it's a tremendous amount of work, but we still need to do it as feminists, like we have to say, okay, like British women were, were struggling for suffrage, but Indian women were, trying to decolonize their country and drive away, an empire that had ruled them for 200 years. So maybe there are some strong women there too that we can introduce within the feminist narrative. And this is obviously just an example because I'm from the subcontinent, but there are lots and lots of examples like this. And we owe it, I feel, to the future generation to give them that picture and give them that genealogy. And finally, I'll say this, I'm not necessarily sure how to operationalize this. And I think that you guys, there are enough minds who, here that do that kind of work. And perhaps, you would know better. But the issue here is creating a moral stigma around whiteness. That in effect is what I'm trying to do, because you talk about intersectionality, for instance, and I assume we're going to talk about that in a later question, but intersectionality and these sorts of principles are abstract principles. They work really well in legal cases, in those, but the point of interaction that applies to development, that applies to just working within development, is this idea that unless we create a stigma around the lack of self-reflection in terms of whiteness, we're not going to be able to change this conversation. And there are lots of ways in which you can create that stigma. I think white women are witness to a lot more racism among their peers that gets swept under the rug very fast when a woman of color is around. So it is that hard work. I realize that it's not easy, but I do think that every one of you, I mean, not even just in a professional context, but just even in a personal context, has tremendous power to change this conversation. And I mean, the book gives you some ideas about how you can do that, but I would say, yeah, 1, 2, 3 is, first have conversations with other white women. Second is like, have, try to understand how exclusionary history of feminism influences contemporary feminism. And, and finally, name and shame. Like if you see people on Facebook that are, posting pictures of them in orphanages and, with these kids from whom there's never any consent, and you guys know the problems over there, but people use them as a sign of virtue signaling. It's very popular. So you have to, be a kind of vigilante against that. And so yeah, that would be, I would say, the three things. I don't know if I answered your question, Jessica, if you want to repeat it.
Yeah, no, I think you did, Rafia. That was really helpful. And I think I certainly found one of the most helpful bits in the book, the sort of real stating of the need for white, particularly middle class feminists, to recognize the privilege that we benefit from, even if unknowingly and unwittingly. And it's for us to work out how we compensate for that and how we atone for it. But I think your message about us having the space to call out others, to call out other white women is very well taken and well heard. One of the kind of follow-up questions I wanted to ask you about that was just that I think sometimes we as white women often fall into the trap of saying that we're going to use our access to power to create spaces for others, to create spaces for women of color, rather than attempting to step back from that power altogether. And this sort of dilemma of, should we use our privilege for good ends, or in doing so, do we actually just reinforce it and legitimize it? And I just wondered if you could comment on that. But Sarah, perhaps you've got something else to come in on first.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. So yeah, I know Rafia, you mentioned in your response that white colleagues or white women should be having conversations with other white women in terms of driving this forward. But there are cases where women of color, are in situations where they're also having to have conversations with their white colleagues, and sometimes those conversations can be quite challenging. So, do you have any advice for women of color in terms of how they could go about having productive but challenging conversations with white colleagues, including those in positions of power, where they might be unconsciously using their privilege and contributing to the problem?
Yeah, I mean, I understand what I understand the nature of those conversations. I believe that making the hierarchy that exists within a workplace, for instance, or the disparities in power that exist in a workplace, like making them explicit allows for a better conversation, right? So, you can't just sit there with your boss or your two bosses, two white bosses, or two colleagues from other projects and have that conversation, without first addressing parity. And I feel that when that is done, people tend to, they tend to accord that some respect in the conversation. The dangers happen when, you just thrown together in a group, you're the person of color. I'll give you an example. I was talking to some indigenous, native representatives of indigenous native peoples yesterday from Canada, and she was describing how, and this was within the global health context, and she was describing how the board of this organization was structured such that there were voting members and then there were non-voting members. And so, they had this whole discussion, she says, and we're in the room, but the whole discussion in this particular case was about Native populations and, global health. And she says, we could say stuff, but like we couldn't vote. And the reason I'm bringing up that example is that, yes, in that case, there was a whole procedural mechanism to sort of, pretend that Native representatives of Native peoples were in the conversation without giving them any actual power. Right, to vote. And so in that sense, it was procedurally enshrined. But I feel that even in, even in just a far more simpler context where you're not following procedural rules of voting, non-voting, etc., it's very, very crucial and important at the outset to say, this is me and this is the power I have. So don't go, if you're a person of color, don't go into these conversations without a clarification of what power they have given you in terms of decision making and what the goal is. Because I find that those conversations, if you don't do that, very soon turn to, white people having this kind of, won't you pat me in the back for being in this conversation? And that to me is a waste. It's just a waste of time. And I mean, yeah, it's tricky. Look, because it's tricky and it's a difficult issue, which is why feminism or development hasn't tackled it yet, because the fear is that here we are doing good work and now we start having this very controversial discussion, and everything that binds us together is going to just disintegrate, and we won't have anything left. And what I'm trying to do is argue the other way, that I feel that all of us, and particularly people in the development field, do have very complex and nuanced understandings and are capable of having complicated conversations. We're not like, people like, oh my God, now, our unity in feminism is gone and our unity in development is gone. That's the wrong attitude. But there are other issues, also endemic within the development context that don't exist in other places, because in many ways, the organizations and structures that you work with are microcosms of the larger power game in global society, where white people are in charge and they are saying they're in charge, and they see their sharing of power as a benevolent act rather than an act of justice, and for as long as you see it as a benevolent act and imagine an automatic altruism, that sort of that is afforded to you for doing this work, we just can't change the conversation, yeah. I don't know if that was enough for you. Did I answer everything, or did? Sorry, I did like the two questions. I sometimes get wrapped up in one of the two, and I worry that I didn't answer the second one.
Great, Rafia. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. We're just going to shift gears now into, and you've just mentioned international development, and so that's the context in which we're all working in. And I think the notion of white saviorism mixed up with white feminism is very much interlinked in that. And I think no more so than when we look back on the war on terror in Afghanistan in the early 2000s, right? So using these examples of what white feminists did so wrong then in the naming of support, in the name of supporting Afghan women, are there any modern day examples that we can rely on to showcase what white feminists are still getting wrong today as part of international solidarity efforts? And Jess, I'm just going to ask you if you'd like to come in on the last question before we hand back to Rafia and then Sophie.
So Rafia, a very similar question, but in the book you critique the well-meaning white American feminist Kate Millett for assuming that she knew best how to help Iranian women in the wake of the revolution, for example, by getting the media coverage. And that example really hit home for me, because that's something I'm sure I've done precisely that in my job, of assuming that I know best how to support women in the global South. And it made me reflect on what is the equivalent thing that I and other white women in the UK international development sector are doing today. Because it's always easy to look back and see what you've done wrong in the past. It's much, much harder to work out what you're doing right now. And so just from your observations, just very much following on from Sarah Nell's question, where do you think that white women in the international development sector are taking control and ultimately putting our own benefit first, rather than really being genuine allies?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say that the international development field, perhaps second only to publishing, is dominated by white women. So, and I see that as a hopeful thing, because I do feel that white women might be more amenable to transforming that than white men. But that's just like my optimism coming out. I think that the entire field of international development is sort of, in tangible terms, yes, you're providing support to organizations, indigenous organizations, or you're working on the field in various different capacities on development projects. But you're also creating a moral narrative, right? You're creating the moral narrative that white people are good and they're doing all of this stuff for you, and how benevolent they are, to do it for you. And until you dislodge that moral narrative and, and aid and development stop being, this emblem of altruism, that countries point to in terms of what they're giving and what they're doing. That moral narrative has to be changed. I don't think that it really helps anyone except perhaps white people, in that it continues this narrative in the world. Brown, Black, and Asian people are inept and they don't really know what to do. They are sort of, infantilized, and their needs are, subjected to a very reductionist calculus, where, I was telling someone, one of the interviews I did, I think recently for Radio New Zealand, and they're like, well, but we are doing it that way. And the answer is no. This is not benevolence. This is, a kind of virtue signaling that doesn't have a numerical value. And because it doesn't have a numerical value, it's imagined as non-existent. So, so I think that, you know, it's within international development in particular, it is very, very, I think those conversations need to happen amongst you guys on how, you know, this larger global narrative. I mean, Afghanistan is a great example, right? Like the US completely failed over there. You know, and in the book, I write about the $400 million for job training that were allotted by USAID, which, you know, they say it was gonna help like so many Afghan women, and only 2 or 3 women were helped by these $400 million, and no one knows where the money went. So there's a lot of issues there. I mean, I realize there's corruption, there's subcontracting, and many different issues. But the question I had after reading, you know, example after example of failed development projects, I started. I mean, you know, you think, okay, yeah, 1 or 2 or even 5, of course, people, you know, things don't always work out, etc. But like when you get to the 25th and the 30th and the 50th one, you start thinking like, what really is the goal here? You know, I mean, is the goal for this development project to really work? Or is the goal just, you know, to have this presence and use, you know, in a very performative way, sort of circle this as you know, an example of benevolence and altruism, and henceforth power, right? Because when only the powerful can be benevolent. So, so I you know, I'm curious to hear what all of you think, in that I do feel this way, that there are certain issues that people will give money to. They're not necessarily the issues that communities need. You know, everyone wants to build a girls' school somewhere, and they don't necessarily want to build toilets. And so there is a, you know, so even like the donors have to be educated in that way, such that they know that these are very kind of racist actions. When you say, oh no, you have to have a girls' school, we're not going to give you this money for anything else. And the problem within that, right? So and I mean, the knee-jerk reaction to this is very bad. I won't lie that there are a lot of women who say, well, you know, I'm not, just forget it then, they don't get anything. You know, if I'm so bad, they don't get anything. And that is, you know, that is the most common reaction. And it is sort of the equivalent of saying, well, if I'm not winning, I don't want to play. You know, if I'm not in charge and you're not ensuring that I'm queen bee over here, then I'm not really interested in, you know, in being part of this. So you know, so there's a lot of work to be done, but you know, I really think that there centrally needs to be an effort made by international development communities or professionals to sort of rewrite the impetus for aid, and, you know, conceptualize aid in a very different way, because you can't, it's a systemic problem, right? I mean, you can fire this person and make that person go through meetings on, you know, inclusion and diversity training, or you can change this project a little bit because now you know, you went and spoke to the community and this is what they said, but the mechanics will still be the same. And I think that everyone who works in international development needs that, you know, needs to understand, because once you have that, then you understand your own role differently, you know, and you are less likely to use your power in a dominating and subjugating way where these communities are concerned. And, you know, and you create mechanisms such that the complexity of those communities is visible, you know, I mean, so that like Bill Gates can't have his chickens, and someone else, you know, says, oh, I'll give everyone 5 potatoes, and, you know, they'll have, I mean, these are extreme examples that you guys know better than me, that this is what exists. This is the idea that the problems of these populations that we are helping are simplistic. They can be solved by 1 or 2, like magic, you know, by magic. And, you know, and so therefore I'm going to make the entire framework, even though, you know, I've never lived in that culture or understood it. So there's a tremendous amount of waste going on because of the inability to do that. So, you know, you could operationalize this even in terms of efficiency, in that, you know, when you don't do it, you're inefficient, because now you have like these well laid out plans, but they are so decontextualized that, you know, they're destined to fail. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Oh, so Jess, did you want to?
Thank you to Rafia for answering the questions. And just that one of the things we've been looking at is Ada's reparations. And I'm sure that's a question that may come up later, but that I think everything that you just said really makes a lot of sense. So thank you so much for the contribution.
Of course, thank you.
Perfect. So that brings us to the end of the discussion portion of today's session. And thank you, Rafia. That was such an all-encompassing discussion, very rich. I'm sure lots and lots of takeaways, some really helpful practical examples as well for people in the audience. So just as a reminder to everybody that the Menti is open for you to pose any questions to Rafia specifically, or if you have any wider comments or reflections that you'd like to share. I believe the link is in the chat box, but Yamina, if you might want to put it in there again. But also I'd urge anyone, if you feel comfortable to, please just raise your hand in Zoom or physically, and if you prefer to ask your question verbally. And I think it's really important to stress as well that you don't have to have read Rafia's book in order to pose a question. Don't feel that should be a limitation as to your ability to ask the question. And really, as part of what Saranel described in the kind of the objective of this meeting, the objectives of this meeting, and the kind of the guiding principles for the kind of culture that we want to create in this space, it's to have that kind of open discussion is to suggest to white women in the audience, do you have any particular challenges or struggles with the issues that have been raised today that you want to share? And more broadly to everybody else, are there any good examples of allyship that you have that you might also want to share? And of course, while this event is on white feminism, I think it's really important that if you have any questions on building allyship, even among women of color, given that women of color aren't a monolith, and that there is obviously that diversity and difference as well within the grouping of women of color. So whilst people are putting their questions in Menti, if I may, Rafia, because it was one of the points that you had talked about, if I have the ability to just ask you a question to kick us off on intersectionality, which you've already alluded to and talked to some extent. So the question, I guess, was just, would you describe yourself as an intersectional feminist? And if so, how do you define intersectional feminism? And what actions would you say set it aside from white feminism?
Yeah, I mean, yes, of course, I definitely see myself as an intersectional feminist, and my understanding of intersectionality perhaps veers very close to the legal understanding, the original reason why Kimberly Crenshaw came up with the term, which is that you have to look at the convergence of different different aspects that affect a person's life. And in this case, it was you can't understand gender discrimination that a Black woman faces without understanding the racial part of it, and that those are inherently intertwined and they're not separate. So yes, I see intersectionality as a great way to understand or cater to the whole person rather than just one aspect of their identity. I think that at the same time, I think that intersectionality, the intellectual work of making intersectionality applicable to all different contexts beyond the legal context is ongoing and has to be ongoing because, because there are confusions. In some ways, I see intersectionality as a way out of this, kind of impasse where these conversations aren't really happening across race because it sort of lays down the framework. But in another sense, I also worry that because it was generated from a legal framework, that we start relying too much on those sorts of legislative or judicial frameworks in order to provide justice, right? I'm saying that it doesn't have to necessarily be, that doesn't necessarily lead us to a solution. We can't find all the solutions within a legal system. And so yeah, I mean, I see myself as an intersectional feminist, and I hope that people understand what that actually means. I feel that there's a very established lingo now in terms of being woke and intersectionality and all these these concepts that are coming up, and I'm very hesitant because I feel increasingly that intersectionality is becoming a kind of brand instead of a movement, where it means anything and everything. So I do worry about that. And another point I think I wanted to make in response to someone's question was about the amenability of or the practicality of these discussions. Like, how do you in practical real life make these discussions happen? And I really tried very hard in the book for the book to be a tool to begin those discussions. I felt like this work is realistically, this work is put on the shoulders of women of color all the time. And I wanted them to have, and in those moments when you face those conversations or you're asked in some way to be the translator or representative that's decoding the behavior of your community or your religion or whatnot, it's very difficult to come up with how claustrophobic that demand can be. And so I really, like, in my mind, saw this book as like something like, here, read this book, and once you've read it, then we can talk, because I have tried to show how the tentacles of this are in everything. They're in the way journalism works, they're in the movies, they're in the way international development works, they're in our history. So but it's difficult to communicate. I always wished that I had something that I could just give a person without like having to sort of come up with all of it myself. And in that sense, this book is a tool for you, for people. I mean, it's funny, some of the feedback that I get is of people leaving leaving these books on their boss's desk and, leaving it in the break room and stuff, because they're thinking, this workplace needs to read this book. And so that is the goal of the book. It's an attempt to show why we are where we are, and in in the best way that I could think of. I am blunt and outspoken in this, but I felt that my experience in all different contexts, like someone who receives aid, someone who lived in a shelter, someone who worked in a shelter, someone who did international human rights, like all these different, I kept going to all of these different worlds and expecting that things would be different, that this problem wouldn't exist. So, in the legal world, I saw, of course, I was working on civil rights cases. I saw it, in the way the shelters are run and how they treat women of color, not intentionally poorly, but just because there's a lack of understanding and an overwhelm of duties. People who are working in these sectors, including international aid, are exhausted because there is so much demanded of them. So, so I kept expecting things to get better. And I found the same problem being repeated. The final stop was Amnesty and working. Not that Amnesty does not do good things, but I saw these mechanisms of, white women sort of, they wanting to be allies, but also very embedded in their own ambitions and in their own ideas of individualist success, which I feel are really, really a huge detriment to building sisterhood. I think that and it's a pity. And in that sense, I feel that white women are losing and sort of almost condemned to a kind of alienation, because the only way they can see their success is if they sort of, elbow everyone else out of the way, including women of color. So, so that is a dynamic that exists and that needs to be made very clear about it, and it is norm changing behavior. What we're trying to do is change this norm of this idea that people should be ashamed of the fact that their organization has an all-white board, and if you do include someone of color in that board, there have to be procedural mechanisms to make themselves heard. Again and again, I would sit in the boardroom and I would make suggestions or have an idea, and there would be crickets, like nobody saying anything, right? And then literally 10 or 15 minutes later, an older white woman would say the exact same thing. And everybody would be like, yeah, that's such a great idea. That's awesome. That's fantastic. We need to do it. And the first time it happens, you think, okay, yeah, maybe coincidence, 3-4 times. But by the 5th time, that they are tuned out when you're talking, because they see your purpose within that discussion as representing like brown people, and now they've ticked that box, but it hasn't changed the culture of that board, which is white and which looks at anybody who is impassioned as a liability. And so that has to be considered, is that like, okay, if I'm going to get a Pakistani person and they're going to be very passionate about drones, that's considered a huge no-no, because you have to pretend, that you're white and therefore not impassioned, because you're the neutral, objective observer God that's going to make the decision. And you're not like these people with their traumatic lives and all of that. You're not like them, so you're much more rational, you're much more capable, a better expert in making these decisions. And that is happening. You asked about contemporary examples. That's happening all the time, every day in boardrooms and C-suites. Is that the person of color is not heard, and especially women of color, with Black women facing the most, erasure and silencing, where they can't win. I mean, if they speak and they feel strongly about something, then they're like, oh, like, look at her, like she's all, we don't know how to act around this thing. And so your input isn't important within those contexts, right? It's just your presence. It's just like that example I gave you, where they had these Indigenous women come and watch them vote, and of course they're going to say, well, we did this. We did this, and had the Indigenous community present when we did this, right? So that's how it's, how the sausage is made, and it's very tough. It's very tough to figure out in different situations whether you're being tokenized, whether you should let yourself be tokenized, whether your presence alone is helping, in that, even if you're not voting. And in that sense, I guess I would say that I know this is an uncomfortable book for white women, but the discomfort that they face or feel when they're reading through this is the discomfort that women of color feel 24/7, all the time, especially in interactions with white people. You just feel uncomfortable because there's so many things that you have to sort of file and edit and and change to be in that conversation.
Indeed. So much, Rafia, that I could unpack in that answer, and so many elements that you addressed as well as part of that response. So I think what I would say is that there are a good number of questions that have come through the Venti, and to give our audience as well an opportunity to have some of those questions addressed. I'll try and pose a number of questions at the same time to you, Rafia, and then hopefully we can get through as many of them. So the first question that we've received is that you said, Rafia, you flagged a small window during which the book was published. How do we all feel we can actively keep that window open or slow down its rate of closing? And then the second question I'd ask you, because I think throughout the answers that you've provided us, Rafia, you've spoken a lot about what are the kind of individual things that particularly white women can do to try and be better allies. But we've received a wider question here about so how can we elevate discussions of white feminism from individual acts of being a better person to issues around structure, the embeddedness of white feminism and racial capitalism? So I know that those are two huge questions, so we'll kick off with those, and then I've got another set of questions right after that for you, Rafia, before our time wraps up.
Okay, in terms of the window and how you keep it open, I think that there needs to be more vigilance of when people say these sorts of things. Like, for instance, I'll give you an example. My book came out, and the Times had just like the worst review ever of the book, which kind of showed like this woman felt viscerally attacked by this book. And what she did after that, like we were on it with Twitter, I mean, like she set all these Twitter trolls after me that I was fighting for weeks to get rid of, and so, being conscious of that fact, this assumption of parity when you're talking to a person of color is very, very dangerous, right? Because because a lot of white women believe that parity means competition, right? So if you're in this workplace and I'm in this workplace, I'm not going to interpret you as a woman of color with lesser power. I'm going to see if I can win against you and get farther on. So yeah, I mean, I think the windows can remain open if only with the help of white people, because you know, we can't rely on horrific events like the murder of George Floyd to sort of create these openings. And I do think that this moment in particular is it's a very it's a moment where a lot of things are changing and cultures are being transformed, and the rules are being rewritten. So there is tremendous opportunity right now to change these narratives and to keep that window open, but it requires a push, right? And the hard thing is that, you know, I'll speak for myself as a woman of color. I see this as the most important thing because it affects my life constantly, right? But for white people, there's a danger that they compartmentalize this as, oh, one of the issues that, you know, people are whining about and we have to listen to and, you know, pretend like we're interested and act like, oh, say these buzzwords and stuff. And then we can move on to the real work, right? And until the work of, you know, eradication of white feminism is seen as the work, as integral to both what you do within your, you know, within the development sector in terms of the administration and management, and also then, you know, in terms of how you interact with communities and how you sort of work with them. Yeah, I mean, development needs to be less white. There's just, I mean, I don't have a nice way of saying that, because a lot is being missed. A lot is being missed by the lack of cultural contextualization. And I mean, you know, I don't know how to, you know, how to make that pertinent to everybody, but yeah, I mean, like this, it's almost, it feels like, you know, there's white women and they've been ruling the roost and, you know, presiding over things. And so they think that the status quo is great. You know, we're working, we're doing all these things. You know, we've broken all these glass ceilings to do this. And so, you know, and here you open, like, you know, my book is like a Pandora's box. And then people started realizing that, oh, well, these people aren't really as happy with us as we thought, you know, things aren't like, they don't love us to the same extent that we had been believing, because now that they're talking, we are sort of, you know, we're being exposed to all of these misgivings. But yeah, I mean, I think it all has to be out in the open, you know.
Thanks, Rafia. So the next kind of comments and observations.
Oh, did I answer the second one more?
I think the second question was just on how do we make these issues more structural, address them in a more structural way, which I think you did touch on.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that especially policymakers have, you know, that they are in some ways at the front lines of creating parity, because the procedures you're creating for your board, for your, you know, in the way you make complaints, in the way meetings are run, et cetera, all of those procedures put down, you know, they have the capacity to, you know, either increase the, if there are only a certain number of people, women of color, you can increase their impact, right? If you procedurally give them more power. And that needs to happen. Like right now, if there are only 2 or 3 Black or 8, you know, women of color on a board, their speaking rights are considered equal to all the white people on the board. But that's not, I mean, that's a lie. It's an outright lie, because those people are representing communities that aren't present. And the fact that, just their presence doesn't make them equal to all the white people in the room. And so procedures need to be created. I mean, it's unjust to pretend that those people are equal to all the other white people. They're pushing through more, and just from the inhabiting a body that is brown or black or Asian. And so there have to be concrete changes like that, where people understand that justice requires keeping quiet, and in some procedural way giving greater power to people of color in that discussion. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rafia. And I mean, just touching on some of the points that we've been addressing, there's a comment that Leila has left in the chat box saying, in case anyone didn't see this article, it's come out early this year by an anonymous collective of women of color working in global development, who wrote about the limits of feminist solidarity between white women and women of color. And so thank you, Leila, for putting that in the chat box as well. And just some general comments, just to share, not for you to necessarily respond to. Rafia, one of our audience members has said that publicly calling out white feminists versus calling them in. I work in menstrual health. As a movement, we have had more positive outcomes from privately engaging those white women about their problematic behavior, rather than calling out. Another more general comment that we've received as well, largely I think in response to the questions that we asked you, Rafia, about the ways in which perhaps white women were behaving that might not be helpful, although it was seen that what might have been done as part of their feminist solidarity, is asking Rafia to provide examples of things white women are doing is problematic. It is a symptom of not knowing or not caring enough to want to know about the colonial history of white women. So just more of a broad observation there. And another observation that we've received, or comment that we've received, is that somebody has shared that in their organization, they've had a white woman ally who is getting a master's in EDI, so equality, diversity, inclusion, to further her career, as she's seen a gap in the market and doesn't realize that she's taking up space in that way. So thank you for sharing.
And I would like to emphasize that is a huge problem. If any, like, I don't know how many people from different organizations I hear, but if your diversity and inclusion officer is not a person of color, I mean, oh my God, like please just stop with that. You have to, like, at least allow that the diversity and inclusion officer be someone who is from a marginalized community of color. You have to do that. And I know it's uncomfortable, and I know it's like feels odd to have to consider these things in discussions or in who has who and procedures. But oh my God, you just that's what I mean by calling it out. Put a picture on Twitter. And I mean, but I'm not saying that's the only thing, because as you said, there are, you can privately engage with white feminists who, and then they would produce a better result. But, in my discussions with women of color, I spoke to an assistant professor yesterday in Canada, and she said, I'm the only brown person in an entirely white department. And so like, it doesn't matter how many boundaries I create, like inevitably you start thinking, well, if I don't do it, if I don't provide this explanation, if I don't do this emotional labor, it's just not going to be done at all. So, so those are things that have to be considered. But please, like this careerist understanding of diversity and inclusion has to stop. Like, this isn't a ladder for people to climb. This is, a sort of attempt to reconstruct procedures and systems in a way that they're not actively oppressing people of color and using white women, white feminists, as the archetype or the paradigm that everybody has to fit. So if I want to look like a successful feminist, I have to pretend to be white. And I mean, it's just that's just not gonna work, and it's not working. And particularly in an international development, that those ideas need to be confronted and fixed.
I can't agree more, Rafia, absolutely. And if I may ask one final question from what we've got in the from Menti before we then wrap up, if I can ask you this, is the discussion of white women assuming that they know best is also relevant to Western women of color? How can we sensitively challenge Western women of color perpetuating white saviorism? And I think that's also a key issue that has come up recently through your work, Rafia, through a publication in the GADN, which I know that a lot of people were absolutely incensed about, written by a woman of color, effectively defending white feminism. So if we could get you to answer that question, Rafia, and then we can hopefully wrap up and close the discussion. But over to you, Rafia.
So yeah, there was, Sonia Soda wrote this bizarre article, which, I mean, it just misconstrued and misrepresented my book. But that is the reason why I say that there can be brown white feminists and black white feminists and feminists of color who are, still. Look, this has been the system for over 200 years, right? And a lot of people of color, including women of color, decide that their best chance at some kind of success is to be white adjacent or white aspirational, where they take on that role and they see that that this is how we can succeed, is by piping what white women want us to say. So then those white women can say, oh, but this brown woman doesn't think that there is a problem in this behavior. So of course, and there is structural, there's a history of the deliberate creation of these structures. The way the British ruled their vast empire was by creating local classes of enforcers of their laws and enforcers of colonial power, and those are all brown people or black people, the local elites, and that creates people like Sonia Soda who think that and it's kind of a hopeless position in my view, but I felt her lack, it was almost as if she was saying that, look, the scraps is the best we can get. So just eat the scraps and don't raise any more concerns or anything about the whole and how it's unjust that you don't get to eat at the table. And that's always going to exist because that's such an old sort of colonial tactic, right? Where you get a brown person to go against a brown person, and while you are the puppet master. So yeah, that's what I would say, and in that sense, I don't. I don't necessarily. I think the bigger problem is white women. I think this, relatively speaking, is a much smaller problem, and I don't want it to detract from the larger critique. And that's what I would say. I think these are models of success, and there are people who take that on. If you are white aspirational, then someone saying that you are white aspirational to you is like the biggest insult ever, right? Because it denies your agency, and then you can say, oh, this is racist. But that's a false, it's a false argument. But in terms of imperialism, I think it doesn't matter your color, but you have to recognize, if you live in a Western country, that you are complicit in a kind of maintenance of a new colonial kind of idea of the world. And yeah, I mean, that's a privilege. And I would argue that we all have to be conscious of our privileges, right? We are all oppressors in some way. And it's that self-awareness of the fact that you have power or more power that requires a sort of deeper moral commitment to using that power in a fair and just way. So yeah, that's what I would say. I mean, I was shocked to see that Guardian article, but then, once I read it and everything, I wasn't so surprised anymore, because it's like, so typical. Like the Joan Smith goes off and like says, and then of course, like there's like a obsequious brown woman who's like, no, I'll say it, so that she can't say a white person said this about me, I'm brown. So you can see that dynamic, and it's so sad. It's just, and to me also a little dated. I think that, it is a little bit anathema to me how a certain generation is so uncomfortable around these terms and this vocabulary of race. But I have hope that my own generation and the ones after are not going to be so like terrified of talking about race.
Thank you so much, Rafia. I mean, such brilliant insight, and so helpful as well to kind of put everything together about how we, the work that we're trying to do here at the Gender and Development Network as part of the Women of Colour Forum as well. And you've touched on so many pertinent issues. And if we had another hour, we'd be able to stray into some of the other intersecting issues, which I'm so desperate to get into, especially off the back of that Sonia Soda article, but for another day. So before we wrap up, Jess, did you want to step in?
Just to say thank you again, Rafia, for your honesty and your challenge. And I do hope that within GAD we can continue to create this kind of space where people do feel that they can speak the truth, and that the rest of us can listen. And I do hope we can also challenge ourselves as white women, not just to call out racism with our white colleagues. You said that was one of the things that we need to do, but I do think we need to push ourselves a bit further than that. I think there's a challenge that comes from you to read and to listen before asking, rather than just jumping to asking and putting the burden onto women of colour. And I think there's also a challenge in there to recognise the role that we play and the benefit that we've received from being in a colonial country and the continuation of neocolonialism and the structures that creates. And I think it's just so important for those of us who are white women within Gender and Development Network to recognise that and to incorporate that analysis into everything we do. But so I just really want to say thank you to you, Sophie.
Sure. And Saranel.
Thanks so much. I don't want to take up any more time, but just to say that, Rafia, when you said there has to be a reckoning from white women before we can do this, I remember being in the same GADN members meeting a year ago where we said the same thing, and we're here a year later saying the same thing.
Right.
And women of color who are saying this to white women over and over again. And so I think that one of the other takeaways I'd like to see is, and this is something, conversation we're having in Oxfam, really big push from, the Black and people of color staff within Oxfam, is around accountability. And this is a really big thing. So, how are we how are our white colleagues going to hold themselves accountable to us for how they are showing up, and giving us the space to hold them accountable for how they're showing up, because I really don't want another year to go by and we're having a similar conversation on white feminism and we're saying more or less the same things. But also just to say thank you so much for your bravery and your courage for basically, bringing to the space all of our experiences and giving words and depth and meaning to what we've been experiencing.
That means a lot to me.
Thank you.
But I just wanted to add that, if any of you want, me to come talk to your people in your organization, or any version of that talk, whatever, right? I'm happy to do it. As I was telling Sophie when we were arranging this, this is the group that I feel like it's more, you are the people that can make a huge change. And so spending time with you, all of you, is very heartening. And like I said, I'm open to, if you want to have like more informal or discussions that are within your organization, so that I'll happily be the bad guy and point out all these, all these problems, and sort of give people a different framework for looking at themselves and the work that they do and their interactions with other people. So thank you all so much.
Oh, thank you so much for that offer as well, Rafia. I don't know what you've signed up for. I don't think you know yet what you've signed up for. Thank you so much for that offer. So just before we leave, I think Yamina has put in the chat box, if you have just a minute to complete a really short evaluation form for us just about today's event, just really for us to kind of get an understanding of what you enjoy, what issues you want to hear about, and so on. Please just take a minute to complete that. And just finally, again, a massive thank you to you, Rafia, for coming to speak to us. Sarah now and Jess as well for posing all those questions, to the Women of Colour Forum for helping to devise the questions. Thanks also, a massive shout out to Layla Billing, one of our newest trustees, who was also absolutely integral in putting together this event, was the springboard for making sure we had this event. So thank you, Layla. And so, as we mentioned right at the start, we're going to be putting the recording of this session on the GADN website shortly, so just be on the lookout for it when it's released in the weekly notices. And if you haven't yet read Rafia's book, it's available in all good shops, good bookstores, even including Amazon, which I don't recommend you buy from, but there are other options as well. So please do be on the lookout for that if you haven't read it. And just with that, just to say, stay safe, keep sane, and keep in touch, everyone. Thank you so much for making the time today.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.